everybody. The Prime Minister, when he presented, he asked a question, how many people wanted him to give his presentation in English? And I think I saw 6 hands. So for those 6 people, you'll be happy to know I'll be presenting in English. All right. Oh, and one other thing here, let's see. One of the things I tend to do with presentations, I like to take selfies. So get ready. I'm gonna take a selfie. Make sure you wave. Say ICON2018. Yay! All right. Excellent. That is tweeted. Okay. So I'm Michael deAngelo, and I am a recovering C-level executive. I've been a C-level executive for about 15 years, leading organizations in multiple industries. And in the my last company I worked at, I was leading, it was a technology company. I was leading about 4,000 IT workers and had oversight of a IT budget of about $4 billion US a year. And about 4 years ago, I started to learn something that began to change my life. And what I was learning is that there is disruptive technology in both hardware and software and new industries emerging, and it's all very exciting. But there's also disruption happening in how we organize and how we lead. And 4 years ago, I started my own personal transformation on becoming a new leader. And I realized I needed to do this in order to be relevant in the future as a leader. So I'm here today to share with you the things that I've learned. So I'm going to start by sharing with you information about 3 different companies. And I want you to think about what these 3 companies have in common. So the first company is called the Morningstar. They are a tomato paste processing company. Yeah, that's a thing. I didn't realize it was. They are in an agricultural industry, which typically, as a commodity industry, sees single-digit growth year over year. Yet this company sees double-digit growth. And in fact, they have 40% of the world's market share. They dominate their industry. It's an organization that's been around for about 50 years. There's roughly 400 employees. They have 3 manufacturing plants and 23 lines of business. Next company, Valve Software. Valve Software is a Seattle-based company. It's in my backyard. And they have roughly 400 employees as well. They have 1 location. And they've been in business for 20 years. And they are the world's most successful gaming company in the world, and as measured by revenue per employee. The next company, Beurtzorg. Beurtzorg is a Netherlands company. They provide in-home healthcare. They have roughly 15,000 employees and are now in over 20 countries. And they have reduced the cost of healthcare by 50%. Their employee turnover rate is 8%, which is, the average is like in the mid-20s, 25% or so. And so those 3 companies have 2 things in common. So one thing they have in common is that they dominate their industries. They're leaders in what they do. The second thing that they have in common is they have no managers. So the Morningstar, for the last 30 years now, has never had a manager. In fact, employees set their own salaries. Valve Software, since their inception, they just celebrated their 20th year anniversary recently. Since the day 1 of their company, they've never had a manager. And Beurtzorg, for the last 10 years, 15,000 employees, no managers. They have a few back office employees, but the majority of the employees are in-home healthcare. Now, those 3 companies aren't the exception. In fact, there are thousands of companies now that have been going through this transition of managerless organizations. And they're in every industry. They're in healthcare and education, in government, in fact. In every industry that I could think of, I've looked. I'd ask the question myself, what about this industry? And I'd look into the information I have, and I found every single industry has an example of an organization that is practicing self-management. The only exception is law enforcement. Yet, there are several examples of self-management in the military in different parts of the world. So I can imagine law enforcement will be coming up next. It used to be that in order to win, be successful as a company, you had to grow fast and become big. Size was the main way that you won. However, with the rapid change in the technology, you've heard several speakers present that very eloquently, what matters now is not actually the size, it's the speed at which you can sense and adapt. adapt to change, adapt to new technology, and to adapt to the transformative technologies that are happening. So, Amand had actually talked about this a bit, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because he covered it, actually did a great job. But just to touch it briefly, there's industries that are, when you look at these industries, they see exponential growth in terms of the cost of what they're delivering, the quality of it, or the quantity of it, the sophistication of it. I'll give you some examples. 3D printing used to cost $40,000 about 10 years ago. Now it's $100 or less. You see the same thing in drones, and solar panels used to be $30 per kilowatt hour. Now it's pennies. LiDAR cameras, a 250x increase in output. Biometrics and also biotech. Okay, so these organizations that are developing this technology, they are experiencing exponential improvement in their product space. And what's happening is companies that are still using a linear approach to how they organize and manage around the work are having a difficulty keeping up. And so those companies are falling off the Forbes list. So as I said, Amand talked about this quite a bit earlier. And one of those characteristics of these exponential organizations is how they organize around the work. And a lot of them are shifting to this self-organizing system. So that's another change that's happening in the industry. A third change that's happening is the way people show up for work and the way they engage in work. And workers, us as humans, we're expecting different things now from our employers. We're expecting more work-life integration, be able to work from anywhere, mobile devices. And so how employees actually show up is dramatically changing as well. All right, so if there's anything you remember about this presentation, this is the slide. And the main points I want to make, in my presentation in total, is I want you to know that there are now thousands of companies that have made the shift to self-management or are in the process of making the shift to self-management. And most of the companies do not want you to know about it. I work with a lot of companies and I can't talk about who they are or where they're from, and it's because they see this as a competitive advantage. They see self-management in a way to create an exponential organization as a way to outcompete their competitors. So the majority of the companies you don't even hear about. You hear about some of the popular ones like Zappos and others, but most you don't hear about. So the likelihood that there's a company in your sector that's adopting self-management is actually pretty high. Now here's the scary part. It takes roughly 3 to 5 years to really adopt self-management. And so these companies that are adopting that self-management in 3 to 5 years, they'll start experiencing this exponential growth, either exponential quality, exponential cost reduction, exponential quality. So they'll start experiencing that, and as a competitor, you'll start seeing it. But your ability to respond to that is going to be very, very limited, because it would take you 3 to 5 years to adopt that particular strategy as well. So it's not something you can do in 6 months. So by the time you realize your competitors are doing this, it'll be too late. And you'll be one of those companies falling off the Forbes list, perhaps. All right, so that's the first part of my presentation, to talk about why you should care about the topic that I'm talking about and what I've learned. The second part of the presentation, I'm going to talk about not how to do self-management, because that would be impossible. We've been learning hierarchy for the past 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and I can't teach self-management in 20 minutes. But I can teach you a little bit about what it is and what it isn't. So, first question is, so I'm going to talk about what is holacracy, and there's some obvious questions that pop up when people think about it. First of all, what happens to bosses? When I first started learning about this concept, I started Googling it, and the very first article I read was from Harvard Business Review, and the title of the article said, "No More Managers." And my first thought when I read that was, well, if there's no managers, who do the employees complain about? So that's one thing I'll cover a little bit. And also, how do you ensure accountability and self-management? And how do you avoid this chaos without the structure? All right. So the first thing to know, let's set some groundwork. The first thing to know is that there's a body of work by Frederick Laloux, Reinventing Organizations. And he describes the science behind organizational systems and how things, you can pick a starting point called these pack or tribal systems, and they also color code these systems. So in this one type of organization, what you see in these organizations is largely they lead by fear. It's boss and everyone's afraid of them, and you typically will see this in gang type of organizations. But their main purpose is to, is to lead by fear. The next evolutionary step in organizational systems is actually the hierarchy starts to come in. And this is referred to as a brown organization, although it looks yellow on the screen. And in these organizations, the main shift there, the main bit of innovation there is around repeatable processes, around structure, around control. This is where you start to see 5-year strategic plans and these sort of things. And you start to see this distributed authority within that system. The next is the orange level organizations. And in these organizations is where the new concepts that start to come in is about profit and about profit margin and competing, and companies will start to invest in innovation, and you'll see the formation of innovation teams or innovation divisions. So innovating became a form of actually competing in the marketplace. But they're still driven largely by metrics and KPIs and OKRs and those sorts of things. The next level of organizational development is the green organizations. And these organizations, where they start to talk more about, instead of about their own individual performance and winning, it's more about the customer experience and about the employee's experience in the work environment. And you'll see things like value-based hiring, or phrases like culture will eat strategy for breakfast. So that's the next level. And then finally, this last level, where I'm talking about today, are Teal organizations. Now in Teal organizations, you'll start to see new concepts that are about wholeness, and they're purpose-driven. And it's about the organization having an aspirational purpose, and about employees having their own personal purpose and getting those aligned. And one of the characteristics of a Teal organization is self-management, okay? So in those previous 3 levels, all 3 of those have hierarchy, just different levels, just different sophistication of hierarchy. All right, so what is holacracy? Well, first of all, let's define hierarchy. What is hierarchy? Hierarchy is a structured approach to governing how work gets done in an organization, and it uses a predict and control methodology. So we're going to predict by we're going to create a 5-year strategic plan, and we're going to make sure we achieve that 5-year strategic plan by setting up OKRs and having organizational goals, and making sure that people's position descriptions clearly map their own personal goals, positional goals, and that they align. Right? So those sorts of things. And every year we'll have an annual performance review. And so these are the characteristics of a hierarchical system. Holacracy is a different structured approach for governing the work that's done at a company, but it uses a sense and respond. So it builds capability and muscle around sensing what is happening in the environment, what's happening with our customers, what's happening with the competitive environment out there, and all employees are essentially sensors. And there are processes that allow them to introduce change within the organization and respond to that change. Sort of like an amoeba, traveling. So holacracy is a structured approach to governing the work. It's just done in a slightly different way. But the real sort of nut of it, and there were several speakers previously have talked about this, the real nugget is that to make this shift, it's not about process or about tools or technology. It's about a mindset shift and thinking differently. It's about, instead of a hierarchy of people and organizing people, an organization in holacracy organizes purpose into sort of a taxonomy of purpose. Instead of static job descriptions, you have dynamic job descriptions, which are changing all the time. There's smaller job descriptions, we call them roles. And individuals can carry multiple roles, and they can come in and out of roles depending on what the organization needs. But they're dynamic and constantly changing. Instead of delegated authority, it's constitutional authority, which we'll talk about in a second. And instead of these large-scale reorgs, which we've all experienced, reorgs happen in a very small incremental way. An organization, previously we reorged probably once every couple of weeks at least, just small reorgs. And these are reorgs that employees were introducing as a result of something they're incensing. All right, so here's what it looks like. One way it looks like. So this is a product that our company developed called GlassFrog, and this is essentially one of our teams, and it's actually the team that built this product. And you see that there's a bunch of roles. That's what those little green circles are, and blue circles. And those are the roles and the names, and you can tell that for some of those roles, you have multiple people filling them. And in some cases, you can see the name up there multiple times because a person can fill multiple roles. And then for each one of those roles, it's really clear what the purpose is, the outcome for that role, and what is it that other roles can expect. And those are accountabilities. So each of the employees actually is involved in the development of this information, and we're constantly refining based on gaps that we're finding day to day. So if we were to walk into an organization that's practicing holacracy, this is what you would see. You'd see people working. They're just talking to each other, getting things done. There's just like you would see in any other sort of work environment. They'd have meetings, and there's talking about different issues and collaborating, trying to figure out things. What you won't see are bosses. You won't see people telling them what to do, or people deferring. Well, let's just see what the boss wants and see what the boss needs, and let's check with the boss what the priority is. You won't see that. The other thing you won't see is you won't see bosses basically, quote, empowering people, giving them the authority to do something. Because in holacracy, your power doesn't come from individuals. The power comes from a set of rules called the Constitution. And everyone plays by the same rules. Okay. All right, so great. But what about these other things? What happens to the bosses? So that was certainly my situation. I was, like I said, a C-level executive implementing holacracy in my organization, and that was one of the questions in my mind. And what I discovered is that bosses in a holacracy, particularly when they're transitioning from a hierarchy to holacracy, what happens to them is they become leaders. They become coaches. And for the most part, bosses are there because they have a lot of experience. And so that experience is still needed and is still valued in a self-managed system. It's just delivered in a certain, in a particular way. So you just have more leadership and more coaches, and you have it with more capacity. So I'm going to try to make this very concrete with an example. Before I adopted holacracy in my previous organization, my role was to work on strategic initiatives. And the way I managed my work is I used a Scrum board, basically, for those who are familiar with Agile. I used a Scrum board, and I had strategic initiatives listed horizontally. And then every Monday, I would come in, and I'd try to figure out what work I wanted to get done that week. And I would put it in a column. And then in the week, I'd move those cards over. And I could measure how much I got done in each strategic initiative. Now, one of the swim lanes was down at the bottom, and it was all of the other stuff that I had to do that wasn't strategic. And I called it other stuff. But I wrote a little quote for myself to remind me. It says, maximize what not to do in this swim lane. These aren't strategic. So my goal was to do the absolute minimum in that swim lane and try to maximize on all the strategic stuff. That's essentially my purpose. So after about 6 months of running this, I was able to get some data and kind of see really where am I spending my time. And what I discovered, that at the bottom, other stuff, that was taking up 90% of my time. And you have to understand, I'm hired to be the strategist, and yet 90% of my time was spent doing operational and tactical things, which is very discouraging and disappointing, and I almost left out of frustration. Well, then I ended up implementing holacracy for a different reason, because we're working on an HR strategy. And I was still using this methodology for tracking my work. And then after a few months, I decided to calculate the data, kind of see where things were. And at that bottom line, the time spent went from 90% to 20%. So now the time I had the capacity to work on strategic things went from 10 to 80%, 800% increase, all right? So that's when I realized this is a thing, and that I will never work in a hierarchical organization ever again. All right, so that is what I'm talking about in terms of building leadership capacity. That's what this change will occur. So the next question, how do you ensure accountability? This is actually my favorite question, and I could answer this question in an hour. I could use up a whole hour answering this question, but I don't have the hour. I have 9 minutes and 55 seconds. So, how do you ensure accountability? The way I like to answer this question is think about soccer. I guess the rest of the world calls it football. In the US, we call it soccer. So think about a soccer game. You have, I think, 11 players per team or 12 players per team. And essentially, it's a self-organizing team. Players kick balls one another, they can see what's going on in the field, they're sensing where the ball needs to go, and they respond just in real time. But imagine, if you will, we lived in sort of weird land where we decided to run our soccer games like a hierarchy. And so we on one team, the red team, they split the field into 4 sections, and each section had a manager. And the manager's purpose is to make sure their players did not make any bad plays, that they didn't kick it to the other team, for example. Okay? So that's the red team, that's how they manage. But there's another team, the yellow team. They want to do a little bit differently. They think more managers is better. So they divide it up into quarters, had eight managers in this sort of field. Now that's too many managers for one person that span controls too broad, so they need to add 2 directors. Okay. So this is probably starting to seem ridiculous. But you know, managers, we don't all manage the same. So there's one manager who's really, really good. He used to be an excellent soccer player, and people loved him. He was really empowering. And then there was the other guy who people didn't really care for much. He was really controlling, micromanaging. Okay. So imagine now that one of the players kicked the ball to the wrong. Let's say in the B section, where the evil manager is. So in the B quadrant, let's say that one of the players in that team kicked the ball to the other team. Who is accountable for that? Is it the player, because they kicked the ball to the wrong teammate? Or is it the manager who's supposed to ensure that players don't do that and make bad plays? Or maybe it's the director who's supposed to ensure that the managers ensure that the players don't make bad plays. This is in effect what we do. And the epiphany I had when I thought about this was that, and one of the reasons why I love the question, how do you ensure accountability? That question presumes there's accountability in a hierarchy. The hierarchy system is not a system of accountability. It is a lie that we continue to perpetuate, but it is not a system of accountability. All right, so that is the 2-minute answer to that question. So how do you have, next question, how do you avoid chaos without structure? Well, first of all, holacracy, it is actually a structured system. And in fact, it's more structured than a hierarchy. If we go back to this analogy that I was using earlier, and I were to ask you, in this company, what are the rules of the game? Well, first of all, the rules of the game are the soccer rules. But then there are the rules of the game depending on which team you're on. If you're in the lower right-hand corner, that team plays by a slightly different set of rules because their manager says, you know, I empower you guys, just go ahead, make the decisions, I trust you. If you screw up, that's okay, we can learn from our failures, I'm there to support you. That's one set of rules. And if you're in quadrant B, you play by a different set of rules. So as an individual employee, there is ambiguity in what the rules of the game are. In holacracy, there is no ambiguity because we don't have that kind of structure. In holacracy, there is the book, and this is how we operate, and these are the set of rules. Much like in soccer. All right, so the things that are in those set of rules are things like the definition of terms, there's some terminology you have to learn, basic responsibilities of filling various roles, and how do you propose change in the organization, where your authority to act comes from, how do you go in and out of roles, how do you get assigned to new roles and leave roles, and those sorts of things. So it has all of the structure, even structure around the meeting formats, and to ensure that everyone has an equal voice and safe space as they sort of triage issues. Okay, so organizations that operate this way, here's some data from an organization as an example. Their operations performance, they used to measure it every single meeting. They measure the speed at which they can discuss and resolve issues. And the time, and after they implemented holacracy, the average time it took for that team to bring up a new issue, discuss it, and make a decision about what needs to happen next or make a decision on the specific issue. The average time was 2 minutes. Went from 20 minutes to 2 minutes. So they saw a 10x increase, over 90% change. Another metric that they captured is from the employee's perspective. To what degree do they feel empowered to resolve their own issues? And they measure this every single week. And in the hierarchy system, they were measuring this before, in the hierarchy system, it maxed out at about 60%. Once they implemented Holacracy, that number went up to 90%, and they saw an increase, 50% increase in that measure. Okay, so what is it you can do next? Hopefully, the information I've shared, the things that I've learned over the last few years, is at least inspired you to think about and realize that there's actually, but also relevant as a company. And some companies will adapt to this change, and many are, and some won't. The change will happen to them. So what I would recommend, if we were having a one-on-one conversation, what I would recommend is learn more. Buy the book, Reinventing Organizations. It tells the largest story of what's happening in the world. You can go to our organization's website, you can go to free trainings, webinars, those sorts of things. And there's a book called Holacracy that teaches you specifically that particular methodology. So thank you very much. My name is Michael deAngelo.
Thank you very much, Mr. Michael deAngelo.